Shabbat Shalom. As many of you know, I was born in Israel, but I really grew up in France. When I was 7, we moved there. My parents were very strong Zionists. They never expected we'd spend so much time in France. So that when we moved to France, we were really still living in Israel while we were living in France for all those years. And we ate Israeli foods, and we had a constant stream of visitors from Jerusalem coming in and out of our house. And there were books about Israel and Jerusalem everywhere. And the news in Israel was the beat of our awareness of what was happening. And I can't remember a single time a French event made much impact in our family consciousness. But I remember all the Israeli ones. I remember when I woke up and they looked so serious and told me that Yitzhak Rabin had been assassinated and other events. And amidst all this news and the beat of what was happening in Israel, remember as the years progressed, that Iran was more and more a part of what people were talking about. Remember when I went back to Israel for my bar mitzvah, and we planned to tour the whole north of the country, but Hezbollah were sending rockets back then also, and we had to cancel that whole part of our trip. And our close family friend, Yossi Halevi, a commentator and journalist, was often a guest. And I remember these long walks and coming back and talking about the threat of Iran and how Israel always seemed to be on the cusp of attacking. It really never did. And there was a constant theme, Iran's growing power and its nuclear program and what was going to happen. It's always there. I remember even years later when I was becoming a journalist, or already worked as a journalist, was going back to get my degree in it in Montreal. And I was talking to the deans of the program over the summer, and they said, well, what do you think is going to happen in Israel? And I said, well, they're going to go after, I think they're going to go after Iran. And they came very close to it. That was the summer, I believe, when a very different Netanyahu government, this time, I guess it was some kind of unity government, but with Barak, left-wing member of the Labor Party as defense minister, and they came very close to it, but they didn't. And it was like this kind of nightmare over and over for Israel, for the Jewish people, for the world, a strike that could solve the problem, but also had this big threat could go into much greater conflict and bring in the whole area and the world. And it always seemed to almost happen, but it never did, just never did. Until Thursday, when it actually did. Or seemed to have done. Still not 100% sure. And we probably will not know the real facts of what actually has happened for days or maybe weeks or longer, because we're in the midst of all of it. It's interesting because as I've been reflecting on all of this, another stream of thought has entered into my mind, especially on the Thursday and next day. And I was thinking about how, despite always having the sense of the threat of Iran over us, I never thought of the people of Iran as our enemies, somehow, as the enemy of the Jewish people, because they were so far away, and there was never really any ill sense between the people, and it was somehow theological and ideological. And as an Israeli who's spent a lot of time in Israel and been involved in peace work and other work, I have often had the sense that our immediate neighbors do hate Israel. One can feel it, but never with the Iranian people much on a deep level. And I remember when going back as a journalist to school, as mentioned in Montreal, and there are many Iranian Muslims in Montreal, and had many Iranian Muslim friends. Had one who grew up in Canada to Iranian parents, and knowing he was coming from a country that was, his roots were in a country that was enemy with where I was coming from. He had no ill will, was always very curious about Israel. I remember I had another friend who had grown up in Iran and only come over as a teenager to Canada. And he described to me growing up chanting, "Death to Israel, death to America," every morning at school, and all the brainwashing around it, and the vehemence that was expected by the students when they chanted it, that the more they chanted it, the more they got happy smiles from the administration of their school. And it had filled them with some kind of hate for Israel and Jews, and they'd put their fists up in the air and show their passion. But it faded very quickly. He arrived in Canada, and it was very shallow. It was very quickly, it faded away. It meant little to him. And he was just shocked to come into a country where nobody tells you how to think or who to hate. And that other friend I just mentioned, who grew up to Iranian parents, and I lost touch with, but he saw me out a few years ago, and still very curious, suspect coming from a community very, very critical of Israel about the conflict. But he was interested in the view of Israel in the conflict with the Palestinians, and even came to one of our Zoom lectures at the synagogue to hear what was going on here. And after October 7th, this person was the only non-Jewish person, really, that in my longer-term history who reached out after October 7th. The only. I mean, I have to inquire about my family especially, but colleagues of other faiths, nobody reached out. Even many friends who are Jewish, who know I have family but are not connected or did not reach out. He reached out in this very personal way, asking about me and telling me he just had another daughter and had actually chosen the Hebrew name for her and wanted me to really explain the Hebrew root of it and was it appropriate. This is somehow what I've been holding in my heart these few days, that despite the political machinations of why this moment or what moment, but the truth of Iran's threat against Israel and the importance not to underestimate it and not to underestimate evil. And perhaps one of the most common threads in our tradition, through our most cherished stories and marked in so many of our holidays, not to underestimate those who do seek to go after the Jewish people and destroy the Jewish people. And that evil does exist in the heart of every human being, but when leaders embody that evil and let it to come out on every side, it can't be ignored or pretend as if it's not real. On the other hand, we can't let that truth lead us to despair and to ignore the facts and the truths of other human beings who are seeking mutual understanding, especially those of two people who barely know each other. And people who just want to do good and walk in the ways of justice and humbly with their fellow human beings. We cannot despair either of the road and of a world of peace, even though the journey seems far away. And sometimes one human connection can change a person and have that effect. Very quickly, a story I wanted to share as well, of having gone to one of probably the best interfaith programs for a week training at the University of at the Seminary of Hartford, with many Muslims and Christian clergy and lay leaders. And it always stayed with me that there were two Turkish Muslim journalists there who, after a few days, and we all got along so well, admitted that they'd been raised to think extremely poorly of Jewish people. But much more than that, Zionists were pure evil. And when they heard that those really nice people there were Zionists, they were in total shock. They just said, "They're Zionists?" They just couldn't believe that all the Jews there were some form of Zionism, many different shades of what that looks like. And by the end of the week, they said they wanted to go back home and tell everybody how wrong they were about what they'd grown up thinking, that it was more complicated. And then I also remember from my own point of view, having moments with a Palestinian Christian there who described her own experience and talking about her grandfather who'd been let out of Jaffa at gunpoint, and in my own self, bringing more awareness of how the story of the founding of our homeland created real pain and suffering in other people and what they had to go through and go through. And that somehow those personal truths have to and national truths and have to coexist. We have to hold them in our being and struggle with them and strive like our Parsha in the beginning to make it into a flame that doesn't die out, but that keeps growing to bring more light and more truth, and ultimately, please God, more peace to our broken world. Shabbat Shalom.